Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about trebuchets. And I'm not going back to the Middle Ages or any other time in history. What I'm going to show you is a very nice idea that you can use in pawn endings. Learning patterns in chess is actually very useful, particularly in endings where very often we don't have time to make important decisions. So I'm going to first show you the main position that you should have in mind, and then we're going to move on to more complicated endings, not only pawn endings, because this idea can be used in other endings with more pieces, because pretty much any ending where we have pawns and pieces can liquidate into a pawn ending. So first, the base position that you should have in mind is two pawns on the same file of different color blocking each other, as we have in this position. And the kings should be eyeing both pawns, as we have in this case, and a knight's jump away from each other. So here we see a king on f6 and a king on h5, a nice jump away from each other. And in this position, the side moving is the side losing. So this is what you should have in mind. If it is black to play, black has to move the king away from this pawn on g6, for example after king to h4 or king to g4. White will pick up the pawn and then white will push this g pawn. For example, after king to g4, white has to be a bit careful, just moving the king away, defending the g5 pawn, and then this pawn will push, and white will simply promote to a queen or even to a rook and give checkmate. And similarly, in this position, if it is white to play, white has to move away, not being able to defend the pawn on g5. Here probably the most tenacious try is to try to go back with the king by going king to e5, and after black takes, try to go king to e4, and then try to bring the king all the way down to g1 to stop black's pawn. But here black has to be a bit careful, but black should be able to win this ending, for example after king to e4. Black can prevent this idea. If white tries king to e2, trying to go to g1, the simplest way here is to go king to g2 and then start pushing the pawn. The king here is in a very important square, preventing white's king from coming to g1. This is what we call key squares or critical squares in endings. So the king is already on a critical square and black is winning this ending. So now that you know this basic position for the trebuchet, two pawns of different color blocking each other, we can have this position with the pawns on any file except on the A or H files, because in that case we cannot have two kings on each side of the pawns. For example, here we have two pawns on the H file, we cannot have two kings on each side of the pawns, but even in this position, the idea is similar, even simpler in this case, because white is simply going to pick up this pawn and then push the h pawn. For example, after king to g4, king takes, king to h4, white goes king to g6 and then pushes the pawn. So this idea of having to move and this being a problem is what we call a zugzwang in chess. And in this position, since both sides would be in zugzwang if they had to move, this is what we call a position of mutual zugzwang. So now that we know this idea, we're going to analyze positions that are going to be a lot more complicated, but hopefully we're going to understand them because we know this secret weapon that we can use in our games. So here it is white to play, and white played the move king to d5. So white has an advantage here, white's king is more active, so white went king to d5 with the idea to go king to e6 and attack this pawn on f6. And if black plays passively, for example going king to f7, white will simply bring the king, and since black has to move, this is going to be bad for black because white is going to pick up this pawn f6. For example, after king to g7, white can go king to e7 and this pawn is going to fall and white is going to win this king and pawn ending. But black here actually tried a very interesting move, which is the move king to h6. So I'm pretty sure that if you had this position for the first time, you, me, or pretty much anyone would go king to e6. This looks like a very natural move, just attacking the pawn f6. And after the move king to e6, white is not only wasting his advantage, but even losing the game, because after king to g5, we get a trebuchet with white to move. So white is in zugzwang and white is going to lose this position. So the pawn f5 is going to fall and black is going to be winning. So after playing a very natural move, the position would have changed from winning to losing, not even drawing the game. But since white, who is a strong player, knows this idea, white went king to d6, inviting black to go king to g5, and then white would go to e6, and we get this position where black plays and black loses. That's why black correctly tried king to h5, again waiting for king to e6, but after the move king to e7, this attacks the pawn, so black has to go king to g5, and after king to e6, finally black resigned because we got another trebuchet with black to play. So it is amazing how a seemingly simple pawn ending with just 4 pieces can get extremely subtle. And if I take the same game and I just go back a few moves, this was the position that we had after 69 moves, and knowing these ideas can be very helpful to liquidate into a winning king and pawn ending. So here white is an exchange up, but black is trying to set up a fortress with this knight and pawn, trying to prevent white's king from entering, and black may also have ideas to counterattack this pawn f4. For example, after king to d5, black would play king to f5, and if black manages to take this pawn and keep the knight, then king and knight against king and rook is normally going to be a fairly easy draw. So white found a very practical way to force this ending after the move f5. So black seems to have some alternatives. For example, taking the pawn f5 would lose the knight after rook to g1, white gives a check and then picks up the knight. If the king goes to the h-file, then white has many options here, but one idea that I like is rook to g1, cutting the king, and also planning to go rook to g6, attacking this pawn f6. So black tried king to f7. If the king goes to h7, then it's going to be very similar. After rook to a7, white's idea is to give back the exchange and then get this winning king and pawn ending that we just analyzed, where white went king to d5. But again, knowing that this is going to be a win in advance is very hard if you don't know this idea of a trebuchet. And before we move on to the next position, I have great news for you if you want to get better at endings. I recently launched my complete course about chess endings that will provide you with everything that you need to know to play this stage of the game. In this comprehensive course, I first start with the most important ideas in endings, and then I will move on to the most important endings that you will play, that are rook and pawn endings. And then we study all the other ideas that you can use in endings, not only endings with pawns, but we'll also study pawnless endings while practicing in every section. By enrolling in this course, you're gonna get lifetime access and you'll be able to ask me any questions if you face any troubles with endings. And for the next few days only, I'm giving you a massive discount to get my course. So feel free to check the link in the description if you want to know more about this offer. So let's move on to the next position. Here it is black to play. Black has an advantage. Black is an exchange up, a rook for a bishop, but white has an idea to activate the king and attack this pawn on f4. White is happy to trade pawns if he can, because king and bishop against king and rook is normally a draw. We have some exceptional positions where the strongest side wins, but this is normally a draw. And if black plays something like rook to c8, planning to bring the rook to the g-file, for example, here white has the move king to g4, and white is in time to create some counterplay to draw this position. But here the only winning move for black is rook to c3, pinning this bishop, but black is planning to give the exchange back in order to force this winning ending after king to g4, rook takes, pawn takes, and king to e3. We get another trebuchet. We don't need to analyze further. Black is going to win the pawn f3 and win this ending. Now the next position is a very shocking example of how one can lose a very basic pawn ending. Here in this position, black would actually even draw without this pawn on c6. So this position is a draw because in this case the king is controlling the advance of the pawn. So with correct play, black is going to force a stalemate position in this ending. But would you believe that black lost this position with an extra pawn on c6? First here black played the move king to b4, so it seems that black is a bit ambitious, the king is a bit more active, so it makes some sense. And here after the move king to d4, black already has to be a bit careful. Black should have played king to b3, keeping an eye on this pawn, and this should end in a draw with correct play. For example, after king to c5 and king to c3, if white takes on c6, then black will capture on c4 and we will get a draw. But instead black, probably pushing for a win, played the move c5, which looks like a very natural move. We move a pawn forward, we give a check, but after the move king to d5, we get a trebuchet. So shockingly, black is losing a very basic pawn ending. So here black resigned because the pawn on c5 is going to fall and white is going to push the c-pawn. In this position, black is a pawn down, but black has the more active king, which is something very important in endings. But here black has two options, either to attack the pawn on f4 or to attack the pawn on f2. Endings are very concrete, so when you play endings you have to calculate very accurately, but knowing these patterns, like a trebuchet, is a shortcut to reach positions that you're familiar with. And in this position, one option is going to draw the game and the other option is going to be a win for black. The most natural option is to go king to e4, capturing the pawn which is near your pawn f5 in order to push your pawn, but in this case, white is going to get a draw. After king to c6, king takes, king to d5, white is in time to attack the pawn f5 if black goes for the pawn on f2. So here after king to e5, black might try f4, but after king to f5, white keeps an eye on the pawn, and this is going to end in a draw after king takes and king takes f4. But instead, after king to e2, black is going to first take this pawn f2, and then black will force white into a trebuchet. So here, after king to c6, king takes, king to d5, white has to bring the king, otherwise it's going to be a trivial win for black after capturing the pawn f4. But here after king to f3, king to e5 is the only way to defend the pawn f4, but after king to g4, we get a trebuchet and white resigned. And the last position is probably the simplest one, but maybe the prettiest one, because here white is definitely pressing, being a pawn up and attacking the pawn on g6, but if white takes the pawn on g6, then black simply captures on f4 and then picks up this pawn f2, so we get a draw. And another option is to go king to g4, forcing black to play, but here white should probably start calculating what to do after something like king to d5 or king to d3. This is still winning for white. For example, after king to d5, black has the idea to bring the king back and stop the f-pawns, but here after f5, pawn takes and king takes, we saw a similar position where the defending side is not in time to bring the king, so this should be winning, but a lot more forcing and simple is just to force this trebuchet. After f5, black has to take, otherwise white will simply capture and push the pawn, and after f4, here black resigned because we got this very familiar position. So this is really a shortcut. White didn't have to think about this a lot because once you know this idea, you simply force it and you get a winning position. So it is great that you can now use this idea, which is actually not very intuitive if you have this position for the first time. So hope that you can win a lot more endings after watching this video. In any case, thanks a lot for watching and I'll see you next time.